Coming up on This Week in Radio Tech, I'm live in Lihue, Hawaii at Star 94.3 KHKU FM. Our guest, Hal Kneller, is firmly in Southwest Florida. We're learning about a hybrid single-frequency network that Hal put together and engineered, and we'll learn about SFNs and what's important. Coming up next on TWiRT.
This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Broadcasters General Store, with outstanding service, savings, and support. Online at bgs.cc. By Broadcast Bionics, with the Bionics Studio, including talk show control, social media, and visual radio. Broadcast Bionics brings exceptional audience engagement to radio and TV. By Angry Audio. Audio problems disappear when you get angry at angryaudio.com. And by Max Connect Wireless, prioritized high-speed internet service designed for transmitter sites and remote broadcasts.
Hey, welcome into This Week in Radio Tech, the show where we talk about everything from the microphone to the light bulb at the top of the tower. I'm Kirk Harnack. I'm in the Telos Alliance studio, not at the usual place, though. I'm in Lihue, Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, the Garden Island. I'm here at, there it is. She's got a chicken to ride. On the island of Kauai. I'm here at Star 94.3, which is KHKU FM. Very interesting station. I'll tell you about it a little bit as we move on, because it's actually a little bit of the topic that our guest and I will be talking about. I'm Kirk Harnack. I work for the folks at the Telos Alliance, and I appreciate them giving me an hour and a half off on Thursday afternoons to do this show and come to you. We've got plenty of Telos Alliance gear here. I've got a beautiful Telos Alliance or Axia Radius console here. We have some X nodes in the back and a beautiful Omnia 7 audio processor in the rack room as well, processing our stream. And our streaming is done with the Telos Alliance ZipStream 9X2 software. So that's pretty cool. All right, enough about that. Let's get into the show. Our guest today is Hal Kneller from the southwest side of Florida. Hal, welcome into This Week in Radio Tech.
Well, thank you very much, Kirk. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And usually, Chris Tobin is here, and he was planning on being here, just had a server crash at an important site. So Chris had to run out to this important site, use a whole bunch of credentials to make it up to an upper floor at this important site. And so he's taking care of a little problem there. So if he can join us later on, he will, but I kind of doubt that he'll be with us. So Hal, it's you and me. How's that?
We'll do it.
All right. Our show is brought to you by some terrific sponsors, and I just want to say up front, please watch or listen to the messages from our sponsors. If you find any of them useful at all, put that information away in your head. Maybe you can use it later. Maybe you can use it now. And if you talk to any of our sponsors, it'd be great if you'd mentioned that you heard about them on This Week in Radio Tech. Also, if you're watching this back on YouTube, which is quite likely, you might be watching this back after we do the show on YouTube. Please hit the like and the subscribe buttons. I know people say that all the time on YouTube videos. We typically don't say that, but hey, it always helps. And if you make a comment, it does help that algorithm to promote the show a little bit. So, hey, ask a question, make a comment about the show. Tell Hal how smart he is. I'll pass the comment along to him, and we'll it'll just be better for everybody if you would like and subscribe to the TWiRT channel on YouTube. All right. With that said, Hal, I read a most interesting article that you wrote in Radio World not too long ago. Tell me about the topic we're talking about today.
Well, it's a single frequency network hybrid, which is partly single frequency network and then another translator on a different frequency, but with synchronized audio. And it was done in Sarasota, Florida, because of interference issues between a translator and an FM Class A station. So they put this thing together to minimize and in some cases totally eliminate the interference.
Okay, well, we're going to be looking at the topology about that. I'm also interested in the the business and the business reasons behind doing that. What were the logistics that caused this to come about? We'll talk about that, and of course, I want to talk about the engineering infrastructure that made this hybrid synchronized FM work. And then we're also going to talk about in general synchronized on-channel boosters, how that can work, and whether and how to decide whether or not a couple of transmitters in a single frequency network actually need to be precisely synchronized or just close. And that's an interesting topic to talk about as well. Our show This Week in Radio Tech, again, is brought to you by some great sponsors. We're going to hear from the first one in just a few minutes. Hal, let's kind of jump into this. You begin the story about this university that got hold of a radio station and found out they had an opportunity, but they kind of had a bit of a problem too. Kind of begin to lay this out for us.
Well, it's the Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine. They operate several medical schools, one of them in Erie, Pennsylvania, their headquarters, and they have a dental school in the Sarasota-Bradenton area, as well as another medical college. For marketing purposes, they decided to get into the radio business. So they purchased 1220 AM WSRQ, which came equipped with an FM translator on 106.9. And further to the south, about 25 miles south of there, a second translator on 95.9. However, with the flat terrain we have in Florida, FM signals go much further than the predictions that you get from the FCC would tell you that they would go. So this Class A station, 106.9 in Zolfo Springs, about 40 miles to the east of Sarasota, and the translator in Sarasota, co-channel, were not playing real well together and never had over about the 10-year lifespan of that translator. When LECOM purchased WSRQ and the translators, they all of a sudden decided, listening, that this FM station over in Zolfo was creating a pretty big interference problem. The operations manager is stated in that article that I wrote, living in Sarasota, driving in his driveway from one end of the driveway to the other, he would hear Spanish up near the street, and he'd hear the classic rock station that WSRQ was back by his house. And he could repeatedly do this day after day. And there were parts around town where the translator would take a dip in field strength, and WZZS from Zolfo would jump right on in. So they decided that they wanted to see what they could do about it. So they ended up purchasing WZZS 106.9 in Zolfo Springs. And they thought, well, if we just simulcast it, that'll be that. But not so easy, because even simulcasting it, they were feeding one station by the web stream, and they had a nice distribution network for the translator and the AM station. But the station over in Zolfo, being fed off the web stream, obviously had a different delay factor for the audio. Not so good in terms of meshing with the signal from Sarasota. So Charlie in his driveway would still hear, even though he was hearing the same station, he would still hear disparate audio because there were several seconds between the two signals. So they really needed to bring this together and create a true SFN on these two 106.9 frequencies. So that's the beginning of what started that. But what it also did was, instead of just giving them a coastal Sarasota-Bradenton signal, it took them 50 miles into the heartland of Florida, giving them markets like Arcadia, Sebring, Avon Park, Lake Placid, and other smaller communities around. So they actually ended up with a footprint equal to 50 kilowatt FM station.
Oh, okay. All right. And that the flat terrain really helps that out. As you said, the signals go farther than typically the FCC's curves would indicate, right?
Yes, and that's a problem because overlaps are very constant down here. Plus, we have another problem. We have a lot of tropospheric ducting, which is basically like skip. You can, some mornings, pull a station from 300, 400, 500 miles away like a local. It just overrides your signal. So if you don't have good signal strength where you're at from your home station, someone from out of town can just wipe it out.
I think a lot of engineers have heard that, and there's even some maps typically online that the ham radio operators put together, and they help you predict skip on the FM bands as well. I know that in Mississippi, where I have some radio stations, when I lived there, because I was there every day, obviously, we experienced this skip. And sometimes you knew you were just 12, 13, 14 miles away from the transmitter. It may have been a Class A FM, and yet you were hearing another radio station trying to beat in over that on a morning that had the right conditions. I'm not sure what stations they were, but yeah. And then we get complaints, of course, from our own employees and from advertisers saying, hey, I'm Do you guys change formats? I heard some station from New Orleans coming in, So yeah, that skip is pretty interesting. So you want to put a heavy duty signal. Let me ask you, let's just cover this topic on a little bit broader scale for just a minute and explain when you have a couple of FM radio stations that are on the same frequency as the proper term is co-channel FM stations. Why is it important for the receiving experience, because that's who we're hitting, listeners, why is it important for the receiving experience that these two transmitters be either super locked together or at least really, really close in terms of their transmitting characteristics with regard to the audio and the modulation? And as part of that answer, I guess we're also going to need to understand, when is it critical that they are absolutely locked together in terms of their modulate index and the phase of when they're going up and down in frequency? What are the criteria that demand synchronization?
Well, anytime you have the field strength of the two stations roughly equal, you're going to have a lot of problems. And that synchronization that you were referring to, and when we say synchronization, we're talking about the whole 9 yards. The frequencies are GPS disciplined, the pilot is identical, the RBDS is identical, the modulation index, the levels, the processor, everything is identical on these two signals. And then you calculate the timing that's necessary to create that sync in your sweet spot. And by that, I mean, think about the old math problem when you were in school about, train A is at a certain city, it leaves the station at a certain time, and you're in the middle somewhere, and another train and the opposite end of the track leaves that station. What time does it have to leave the station for the two trains to come together at a certain point? That's really what we're talking about here. Yeah. Except we are going at the speed of light.
What train leaves here, it's with the speed of light. So, and just to be clear, because we do have some listeners from time to time to this show who are not broadcast engineers, we're talking about the listener, their receiver, let's say in their car, and you said the field strengths, if they're getting an equal amount of signal from two different transmitters on the same frequency, so they're probably going to be approximately equidistant between two transmitter sites that the FCC...
Not necessarily. It depends upon the power and the height.
Power and height, okay, but yes, you're exactly right. They may not be equidistant. You're exactly right, but they are at a point where there's an equal amount of signal from two transmitters that the FCC thought were separated by enough space to coexist, probably with two different owners, although it certainly could be the same owner. And when you're driving through such an area, and we've experienced this. I think the average lay person has experienced driving up a hill and hearing one FM station, maybe at the fringes of its operation. You go over the top of the hill and you don't touch your radio, but now you're picking up another FM station on the other side of the hill. And that's the kind of situation where you may have pretty close to equal field strengths from the two different transmitters. And what stations are doing these days is they're buying up several stations in an area that are on the same frequency and putting the same programming on this, thereby having the coverage of a much more powerful station, maybe with a taller tower. And so there's definitely some economic and business reasons to do that. But you're talking about here the technical difficulties in reception with that. Am I close on that concept?
Shielding in your example, you had terrain shielding, so you were getting a pretty clean signal from the first station going up the hill. Get over the top of the hill, it's a little messy. Go down the back side of that hill, and now you've got another station pretty clean. Now take a big bulldozer and erase the mountain, and have flat terrain. Yeah. Now what have you got?
And so I want to cover one more thing for the consumer level, and that is that FM radios, FM receivers do have a characteristic that we call capture ratio. And an FM receiver is pretty good about receiving station A as long as its signal strength right there is a certain amount stronger than station B. It'll pretty much ignore station B. Unlike AM radio, you're just going to get the two stations mixed together and you really can't hear either one very well. With
Right.
AM, you got to have a big difference in signal strength. But with FM, just a little difference in signal strength will make your receiver capture one or capture the other if its signal strength is stronger. So we're in building a single frequency network. We're depending a little bit on, we're being assisted by this thing called capture ratio within the radio.
You're absolutely right about that. And in an ideal SFN, you have directional antennas and you have areas that the antenna is aiming into to serve a specific area, and you move rapidly from weak signal to strong signal. Whereas in my situation in Sarasota, we had two omnidirectional situations where, with flat terrain, where we did not have a wide area with terrain to separate these signals, so they were mixing together. And that makes the task much tougher to create a seamless single frequency network. In fact, in our article, we show on the map where there are some areas of overlap that do have interference. The idea of a single frequency network, when you have signals of close signal strength, is you use the timing of the transmission, you delay one or the other, to make the area that you want to have pristine be very good. And you can make it so that you can't really tell that there's two signals there. They become seamless at that point. The problem is you can only do that within a 2 or 3 kilometer area. And then outside of that, it's going to start to fall apart again because the signals are not going to reach the receiver at exactly the same time anymore. This is where
actually, this is the next,
get that big change in field strength so that your capture ratio picks it up and you don't get the interference.
You explained that very well. I'm sorry to interrupt. So just because I want some details on that narrow area, 2 or 3 kilometers, you said that you can get them synchronized. We got a quick break first, but I want to reiterate what you said there, that you want to get them synchronized in an area where the field strengths are so similar that capture ratio does you no good. But hopefully, as soon as you're closer to transmitter A or closer to transmitter B, capture ratio then fixes the problem. And because you can't have perfect synchronization everywhere between transmitter A and transmitter B, because of this thing, the speed of light, we can't make it, work out everywhere. We can make it work out over a small area. Then that capture ratio fixes the problem for you. So we're trying to fix the problem where capture ratio doesn't help us. Did I summarize that okay?
Exactly right.
Okay, good. This week in Radio Tech, we're talking with Hal Kneller. He's an expert at on-channel boosters, single frequency networks, and getting these transmitters perfectly synchronized. We're also going to discover in a few minutes, about the size of this area, whether how big of an area can you get this synchronization going, and are there situations where maybe you don't need such tight synchronization? That's going to be interesting with terrain shielding and so forth. And then we'll hear more about this particular project in Florida and why it's a hybrid system. That's going to be coming up. I'm Kirk Harnack along with Hal Kneller. It's This Week in Radio Tech, and our show is brought to you in part by our friends at Broadcast Bionics. By the way, this commercial you're about to watch, it doesn't have any audio with it except for some music. So if you're listening, you want to go back and have a look at the show. If you're watching, just take it easy and enjoy this message from Broadcast Bionics. We'll be right back. Broadcast Bionics and the Bionics Studio, a pretty amazing technology. You can combine set one or several of their different technologies and products and have some really cool broadcasting. From studios that figure out what you want to do next to social media that pops up and is contextually aware of what you're talking about, whether it's live streaming or putting bits on social media. Broadcast Bionics has some really, really amazing stuff. So check it out at bionics.radio. Bionics.radio will get you to the website. Hey, I'm Kirk Harnack. I'm coming to you live today from KHKU, Star 94.3 in Lahui, Hawaii, on the island of Kauai. Tomorrow, we're going to take a helicopter ride to the transmitter site. And Hal, I know you've been to a lot of transmitter sites. This particular one, by the way, Hal Kneller is our guest. So welcome back, Hal. This particular transmitter site I've not been to before. We've had an engineer here on island. In fact, it's an engineer who you've met on this show. If you've watched This Week in Radio Tech, Don Mussel. Don Mussel has been the engineer that's helped us out here, but Don says, hey, Kirk, I'm getting a little too old to go to that transmitter site anymore. You just need to go there yourself. So tomorrow's the big helicopter ride, and I understand that this building is on a ridge that's so narrow that there is no place, there's no LZ, there's no landing zone for the helicopter, Hal. It's there's a little place where they drop a skid onto the ridge, and you scramble out, grab all the supplies you brought in the helicopter, and back away, and the helicopter takes off. And if you're just going to be there 10 minutes to reset a breaker, he'll circle. Otherwise, they'll wait for your phone call or come back at an approved time. And then it's getting on the helicopter is the reverse of that. He can't really land. He just touches the skid on the ridge, and you scramble back onto the helicopter. And yeah, we're going to see
I've
how
seen
that
pictures
how that
up there.
goes.
I understand the antenna's on a telephone pole.
There are, I believe, at least 2 telephone poles up there with antennas. And there's some, let's say, some rather challenging engineering going on up there. So I'll have my own pictures. If you want to see, folks, you can go back and find the episode with Don Mussel as our guest. We showed a bunch of pictures during that episode too. So not only this transmitter side, but some others and some lava fields and things like that. So Hal Kneller is here to talk to us about single frequency networks. And as Hal mentioned, in Florida, a lot of flat land, and FM signals go pretty far, and sometimes they go farther than you want them to go. Can you believe that? Usually we try to get our signal to go as far as possible. Hal, we were going to just step into the nitty-gritty for a minute here of this synchronization zone where your field strengths are really, really pretty equal. Capture ratio is not a thing that the receiver can give you at that point. So it's going to be mixing these 2 FM signals together, same audio on them. But if these 2 signals are out of phase with each other as the signals hit your antenna, well, there's going to be a lot of cancellation of the actual FM energy right there at your antenna. So we work to get them perfectly aligned and in phased. But if you move closer to station A, they're back out again. They're not in synchronization. Close to station B, they're no longer in synchronization. Explain how this zone works, and how is there any way to make the zone a little bigger or smaller? Or is that just a function of how well the radio is able to discern these 2 things? I'm sure there's speed of light involved and cancellation of frequencies. Talk to me about this zone that you're trying to synchronize.
Well, I haven't really found any way to make the zone much bigger. When you're dealing with an extremely close amount of field strength from both sites. And in some cases, you could be dealing with a similar amount of field strength from more than 2 sites. But in my case, 2 sites. So what we do is we try to figure out the most important place where we need to fix it. Because it may not be in exactly the same place where the 2 signals are equal, but they may be close enough that the capture ratio isn't going to be effective at that point. So you've still got an issue. So what we do is we do the math. The radio signal travels at the speed of light, and we look at the 2 sites, where they're transmitting from. We look at the site that we want to cover precisely, and we calculate the time that it's going to take the longer run to get there. assuming that it's not right in the middle between the two. And then what we do is we calculate the time that it will take the shorter run to get there, and we subtract the difference. And that's our launch delay at the shorter site, because at that point, then we will make those two RF signals come together. Now, we're already assuming the infrastructure in this system is providing the exact audio to both sites, so that we don't have an issue there. We're making that assumption when we're talking about this part, because there's several parts to this puzzle to make it all come together and work.
I wonder if you could explain an older technology and then move into what we're doing now. It seems like 20, 25 years ago, a company called TFT was offering a synchronization system where you had you had an exciter at the studio, and of course you had just one exciter for the system, and then you transmitted this RF, or maybe you had an STL transmitter that was anyway. You were able to use the exact same modulation from a single modulator at the studio and air that on different stations. Do you remember that? Was that called the Reciter, or was there some other name for that system from TFT?
It wasn't around for too long, but yes, they did attempt it. The problem in those days was we just didn't have the ability to generate the identical audio, and the baseband and distribute it properly. Today with IP, we have a lot more flexibility on what we can do, and with the newer technologies that we have for synchronization, we don't need near as much bandwidth in terms of the audio distribution. For example, the Sarasota system is running uncompressed linear at under 2 megabits.
Okay.
So you couldn't do that in the old days.
Yeah. Gotcha. So, Ken, I realize we don't have the benefit of a diagram or a map here, but help me understand, is the modulation going on at each individual site, but under carefully controlled conditions, or is there a modulated signal being created at a single place?
There's a baseband signal being created at the studio. So the audio processor is a Wheatstone 55. It happens to have AES 192 output. The RBDS encoder comes into an SCA input of the Wheatstone unit. So we have our stereo signal, our mono signal, our pilot, all in the Wheatstone. And now we add the RBDS, the 57 kilohertz subcarrier. To that, it's all muxed in that Wheatstone 55 processor. Comes out as AES 192, which is an XLR connector going to, in this particular case, it's going to a GatesAir IP link called an MPXP. This thing will take either composite input through the old-fashioned BNC analog, or it will take the AES 192. So that is then feeding over IP to the whole network, to the rest of the stations. The 106.9 translator in Sarasota, the 106.9 main FM, AM, FM Class A station in Zolfo, and down to the Venice translator on 95.9, which is why we call it a hybrid SFN, because that's not actually frequency locked to the 106.9s. But if you switch your radio between those stations, because it does have an overlap zone, the timing would be perfect. You wouldn't hear any difference in the audio between those two sites. They sound the same, and the same place of the song or speech, if you're hearing it, there'll be no. It's not like, for example, if you've got HD radio and you don't have the analog and the HD1 synchronized, and you hear that jump in audio, we wouldn't have that in this case. It's seamless.
So I got that. We're able to send the exact same multiplex signal because we're doing it with bits over linear IP. We're delivering this MPX signal digitally to each transmitter site. But we still haven't modulated that onto an FM carrier, and especially not on two FM carriers or more. So how does that happen in a way that's absolutely to the nanosecond repeatable at each of the two sites?
because we use identical equipment, not necessarily in terms of RF power output, but in terms of exciters. So in this particular case, both of the 106.9s are using a GatesAir fax exciter. And that's GPS locked on both cases. Actually, the studio is also GPS locked because the audio has to be timestamped. That way, when it gets to the ends, it knows exactly when it's supposed to go out because every packet has a timestamp on it. And so if we didn't have the GPS at the studio, then we couldn't timestamp it.
Would this imply that there is any kind of automatic buffering at the two transmitter sites? Because I mean, what if a packet is lost or a packet arrives at site A before it does at site B, out of order, out of sequence? Like, hey, this isn't what I was expecting. How does that get fixed?
Yes, the packets they're numbered or labeled. They're time stamped, and they have a very ingenious thing that I think a couple of other companies have started doing. They call it stream splicing. So you have two options with stream splicing. You can have two IP distribution methods. For example, you might have a public internet, typical cable modem or something, or DSL, and maybe you have a dedicated IP point-to-point system. And this is giving you some diversity in case a system goes down. So you send out simultaneously over those two links. You get to the receiver end, which is, of course, one of the transmitter sites, and there is a buffer, and it's taking in bits from both of these paths, and it comes together, and it looks for any missing bits, and if it finds a bit that's missing, a packet that's out of place or whatever, it rearranges it, reshuffles it, and maybe it got dropped on path A, it finds it from path B, puts it together, and sends out a seamless stream to the transmitter. But remember, this will not be in real time. There has to be a buffer delay there. So a DJ can't be listening over the air and talking into the mic at the same time, similar to the same problem they would have with HD radio, where they can't listen at the same time.
Sure. Yeah. Now, I think I just figured part of this out. You tell me if I'm just totally off base here. So there's a GPS receiver at the studio. It provides a clock to timestamp the outgoing packets that have multiplex. At the transmitter sites, you have GPSs there, and you use this great phrase. I hadn't heard it until you told me the other day. GPS disciplined. So you've got a clock there that's slaved or disciplined to the GPS, and I'm guessing that there's going to be a certain amount of offset between your transmitter A's GPS and this how big that buffer is, and you can set that really precisely. Same thing for transmitter site B, and
we can set it to the microsecond level.
Yeah. Okay. And then if, like transmitter site A, let's say it misses a packet and either it has one IP path or it misses the same packet from both. Unlikely, but it's got to say, okay, I'm not going to reduce my buffer size. The buffer's got to remain exactly the same all the time. Otherwise, your synchronization goes out the window, right?
Yes, and it has what's called fast recovery. There's an algorithm in there that will pull it back very close quickly and then fine tune it over the next few seconds.
Okay. Now that's cool. That sounds like something in the Harris gear.
But you will lose synchronization if you lose a packet. I'm saying if you lose a packet from both feeds. Now there's also a way you can do it with one ISP or one IP connectivity, because not everyone's going to be using an ISP. Some people are going to have direct private point-to-points. And that is, you can stream splice on this system with one service. And what you do is you send out the stream, and then you delay, and you send out a second stream, identical.
Sure.
You can delay a half a second, a whole second, whatever. You study your path over time, and you see what kind of issues you're having, and you set your delay for the second stream accordingly. And then at the other end, of course, it doesn't do anything until it receives the second stream. So it's looking at the first stream, it's looking at the second stream, It's making sure that it's happy. And if something gets lost in the first one, it tries to grab it from the second one. Now that only works, of course, as long as your issue doesn't span more than the time delay between the two streams. So if I have my buffer there set for, say, 3/4 of a second, but I have a 2-second outage on the internet, I'm done.
Sure, understood. And what you described,
I say the internet because typically that's where you're going to have your trouble.
Yeah. And what you described there is one of several strategies. I know that because I work for Telos, that's a strategy that we've used to help people with ordinary, left-right stereo codec transmission. But other companies, Harris has done some very clever things as well to improve the reliability, both of single IP path and dual or multi IP path transmission.
Right, and you're doing it with your multiplex at Telos with 2 IPs. You can replicate that stream. So we're coming up with all kinds of cheats to try to make what isn't the traditional old 950 STL path that was pretty reliable. Now we're going off into these other directions, but to make them more and more robust over time.
It's interesting that, and you mentioned this, that it's important to characterize the kind of packet loss that you do have. If you, for example, have periods of 5 seconds of straight packet loss, well, that's going to take a different strategy than if you lose a packet here, a packet there, a packet here, a packet there. One of my transmitter sites in Mississippi, at the moment, because we have an STL tower that's still down, we're having to send coded data halfway around the country. I mean, it goes to Dallas and New Orleans and Jackson, Mississippi, before several microwave hops getting to our transmitter site. And it loses packet here, packet there, 3 packets here, 2 packets there, packet here, packet there. And fortunately, we're able to overcome that pretty well just with the error concealment that's built into the AAC algorithm. So that we're just using the codec itself, the coding algorithm, to overcome that at that site. I have another site where we're using micro MPX technology, of MPX over IP, and we're using forward error correction on that. And as long as we don't lose more than about 50 packets out of 1,000, frankly, even if we lose 50 packets in a row, they all get rebuilt during the buffer time because of the fairly large amount of forward error correction that we're doing. And we only have one path available there. So what I'm getting at is there's different strategies for different problems. And my message to engineers, and yours would probably be the same, Hal, is identify the characteristic or the problem first, and then apply the correct strategy to it.
Yes. And of course, the more error correction you add, the more bandwidth you're taking up. So you have a compromise in the system to determine how much overhead you've got to have for the bandwidth that you have available.
That's a good point. And I know that I've been with Telos for 20 years, so a lot of our early strategies assumed only one IP path and fairly occasional packet loss. Well, we have probably overall less packet loss now than we used to have over the internet as a whole, and bandwidths tend to be a whole lot better now than they used to be, and the fact that you can quite often get 2, 3, even 4 different sources of internet at a given site. So I'm like, hey, I'm in Hawaii right now, coming to you over fiber. It's just terrific. We have very few problems here at this site. When I ping this site from my house in Nashville, I'm on fiber there. It just always works. I mean, it's surprising to see a ping that didn't make it sometime during the night. So good news is, I guess, internet's getting better. Hey, Hal, we're going to take a quick break. It's This Week in Radio Tech, episode 521. I'm Kirk Harnack. Chris Tobin is solving a problem. We'll probably hear about that next week. And Hal Kneller is our guest. We're talking about a hybrid synchronous FM transmission system that he devised and worked out and installed in Southwest Florida. We're also going to be talking about FM boosters, because that's a topic that's hot with a lot of people. When does terrain shielding really help you? When would lack of it hurt you? What's the best way to work that out? And I'm actually, where I am, I'm here to look at some of that myself to get a booster going for our station, KHKU. This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you in part by Broadcasters General Store and by the Henry Super Light. The Henry Superlight is, so many of us, I was talking to Hal before the show, we've used the Henry Super Relay, right? The Henry Super Relay. We've all put those things in. They make it so convenient to add a tally light to an audio console. I remember back in the day, and Hal, you're about as old as I am. You remember when you would just run 110 volts from the tally light into the audio console itself. You'd put it on the announcer's switch because it was a multi-pole switch, right? And part of it was switching the speaker circuit out. Part of it was switching the mic into the program bus, and they usually had some extra contacts available, and you'd wire your 110 volts to that. I must say, I never did that, but I found consoles that were like that, and certainly shocked my wrist a time or two on 110 volts that was in the console on the mic switch. Well, the Henry Super Relay solved that problem, and now the Henry Super Light solves that problem for the LED tally lights that are so popular today. The Super Relay is kind of overkill for LED lights. The Super Light has built-in power for your LED tally lights. It can provide power for your LED light, or if you've got a big honking LED light, takes more power than the Super Light will deliver, well, it'll sync, I think, about twice as much as it will provide, so you can sync some more power to it. Or it's got ordinary relay contacts on it as well, so you can sync, I'm not saying all you want, but you can do 24 volts at 1 amp max on the dry contacts. You can provide it with up to 30 volts at 2 amps external power, and the tally output is 12 volts at 500 milliamps direct. So this thing is so cool. What also makes it cool is that if you've got multiple studios, just 2 studios, or you have 8 studios, you can use the jumpers inside the Superlight to program what address that it is. And here's what I mean. You can have Cat5 cable going between Henry Superlights, and each one, there's a ground, and then you've got, I guess it would be 6 studios, 6 or 7. You can have it control the lights in several studios and not have to do a bunch of wiring, just a Cat5 cable between the Henry Superlights to make them work. There's a diagram about this on their webpage here. You can have a look at that for the multi-studio using loop-through Cat5 cable, studio A, B, C, and D. Okay, maybe it's 4 studios. I'm sorry if I was wrong. But this thing is just so handy. It makes wiring a breeze. It makes it so convenient, and it really gives you time to do the other stuff you got to do. Who wants to spend a day or 2 or 3 just on tally lights? You can put this in, whip it together quickly, and be done with your tally lights. Of course, those contacts, you can also use them for cutting off a speaker feed if your console doesn't do that for you. Hey, I mean, who haven't put in a Behringer console or a Mackie console, or even that new console from Rode? If you want to be able to switch off some speakers, you have the ability to get that done too. You can get the Henry Superlight from our partner, Broadcasters General Store. Their website is bgs.cc. That's bgs.cc. They're down in Ocala, Florida, just a hop, skip, and a jump from where Hal is. And their number there, they're really good on the phone. They're really good. Call them at 352-622-7700. They'll get you taken care of. And they've got this terrific ordering system where they can usually tell you exactly how long it'll take to get your product delivered and where it is in shipping, how soon it'll ship. They just have such good relationships with all of their vendors and computerized systems that just track the stuff. So it's really good. I enjoy working with BGS. I've personally been their customer since the late 80s, maybe the late 80s, I suppose. So check them out, bgs.cc. All right, we're talking to Hal Kneller about single frequency networks. Always a bit of a mystery and black magic to a lot of us. Hal, would you like to say anything more about the hybrid project before we move into on-channel boosters and planning those?
Well, the hybrid project really added that South translator in Venice, W240DI, into the system. And it was just, we decided it would just be the right way to do it, since we were going to be distributing multiplex over IP, that we just send that composite over IP feed down to that translator instead of the separate channel that it had been using before, which was over IP also with a codec. So we just thought we'd spiff it up a little bit with the processor and everything else. So it just made it have identical audio and better audio quality than it would have had before. So that's why we did the hybrid aspect of the SFN.
And this is the one that's not synchronized because it doesn't have much overlap, right?
Well, no, it's not synchronized because it's on a different frequency.
Oh.
It's 95.9.
That's why it's a different frequency. Gotcha.
Yeah. So we don't have we don't have a GPS lock on the carrier frequency there, for example, because we don't need it. We just have the audio coming in timestamped so that it actually is aligned with the audio on the 106.9 SFN.
Gotcha. Understood. You said something earlier I need to ask about a bit more. I asked you if there was some way that the modulation characteristics of the two that are synchronized, if there's some way to make sure those characteristics were the same. And you said, well, it's because they are the same brand, the same type, the same model of exciter.
Same model, identical equipment. We recommend that if you're going to do an SFN and you truly have areas where you've got overlap, that you don't have terrain shielding and you really need to have it clean as possible there, that you use identical equipment at the various sites as far as the exciters are concerned. Now, you could have one brand of transmitter and another brand of transmitter at the different sites, but the exciter is what's going to create that signal for you.
And you're using exciters that I take it are digitally modulated. They have numerically controlled oscillators in them. Yeah. Yes.
And I've done it with Harris, GatesAir, and Nautel stuff very successfully, and I'm sure it could be done with other brands as well. I just haven't done it.
But you sure wouldn't want to mix even two different brands of digital exciters or a digital and an analog exciter, because they're not going to have similar characteristics on a moment-by-moment basis in modulating the signal. Now, that brings me to my final question about that, though, is that is there any kind of I take it the answer is it works fine, but how do you know that two of the exact same model of exciter are going to in fact behave reliably the same, and how much variance from one exciter to another would be acceptable? Now, I know they're running software, I know they're clocked, they're GPS disciplined in terms of the carrier. What's your assurance that they really are modulating these two signals in different cities? What's your assurance that they really are modulating them the same way?
I don't really have any equipment that I can hook up and plug in. It's not like you can put a voltmeter on something and say, well, that one's 6 volts and that one's 6 volts or anything like that.
Right.
Or a spectrum analyzer or anything else. It would take precision lab equipment to do this. And I'll give you an example of something that was done that we did for Cox Broadcasting a while back. But we certainly have a little faith about that it will be the case. But the proof is in the pudding. When you set the system up and you go out to the area where you consider your sweet spot, one of the advantages of the technology that we have today is with your smartphone or a laptop that's connected through an air card or something. You bring up the transmitter's remote control. You log into the codec, you log into the MPXP, whatever, and you tweak the launch delay. And you move it a few microseconds forward. You move it a few microseconds back. You listen to what's going on. You really want to flip the polarity of the modulated signal on one of the sites so that you're 180 degrees out of phase. You better have a deep... I wouldn't recommend doing this in afternoon drive time. But you get yourself a deep null, and if you really want to precisely tune your spot, you tweak that timing for just by your ear on your car radio. You just tweak it for the best possible null, and you're there.
Okay.
Then you flip it back.
That makes it now. Yeah. Be sure you flip it back before. Be sure you put the remote control in remote before you lock the transmitter door. So what if your area of overlap, where your field strengths are very similar, what if that actually falls in an area of low or no population? How much care do you need to go to if you really don't care much about that overlap area?
Well, we were fortunate in that there's quite a bit of farmland between these sites. There's very little development there. But let me tell you where it could get critical. You could be in a situation where your nasty area, so to speak, could be along a highway that's highly traveled, and maybe something that you don't want to pollute. You want to have a clean signal there because you don't want people driving by over a few mile period to go, oh, I can't listen to that anymore, and punch the button. So there may be some times in remote areas where you still have to be mindful.
Okay. Let's talk about on-channel boosters. And typically, isn't an on-channel booster called for when you have an area that you're not covering very well from your main transmitter, specifically because of terrain shielding, and that's why you're not covering some town or village or burg of interest? Isn't that the typical case?
It's some of the typical cases. Another typical case might be a rim shot. Suppose I have a suburban station, let's say, and I'm trying to reach a big city, and my contour fully encompasses that city, but the stations that are licensed to that city may be on a building top there or on towers very close to that, and I have a double situation here. I have RF desensing of the receivers because of those high power FMs that are nearby the city, and I have a reduced field strength from the station coming in from the suburbs, so that the apparent reception is weak. And so we might want to have a booster to mitigate that.
Good point. I experienced that myself in Destin, Florida, at a station that was a real rim shot. I mean, the transmitter was, oh my goodness, it must have been 70 miles away. And, at one point I told the owner, if you want to, if I had to tell the owner, if you want a Destin, Florida radio station, you need to buy a Destin, Florida radio station, because we were in the blanketing interference area of another station, and you almost couldn't pick up our station for your radio desensitizing from the other station. So is a booster, and there was the urban what's the urban effect called when you get reduced signal just because of buildings and such. Because if you took a boat out on the water, out on the Gulf, you pick the station up just fine. But that was part of the desensing as well. So can a booster can't extend your coverage area, can it? But you can fill out where you should be.
Yeah, it cannot extend. Let's say your protected contours in this particular case might be a 1 millivolt contour. A Class C station, for example. A booster cannot be put into use that would extend that Class C's 1 millivolt contour. But there are some exceptions. Suppose that 1 millivolt contour is out over water. If it's out over water, then you can do it. I used to be affiliated with Geo Broadcast Solutions. In fact, you and I did a show about them a few years ago. There is a situation in Los Angeles where they were able to put a booster that covered Malibu, but Malibu was outside really of their contour. But because of the way the water worked, they were able to do it.
Of course, and that would actually help in that Destin, Florida situation, since the 1 millivolt, the area would go over water.
And of course, the protected contours vary by the class of the station. You got B1s and Bs are not the same as a C. You've got the 54 dBu with a B, for example, and a 60 dBu for a C. So the boosters can't exceed whatever that regulatory contour is for that class.
I realize we're actually running short on time. I got two more things here. One thing, what's a quick way to determine, hey, am I a candidate for installing an on-channel booster? What are some criteria that you would recommend people think about if they are considering, would this help me out?
Well, the two things that we just talked about, one is that you do have a contour over a city that you're trying to cover, but you're not competitive there. And the second is, due to terrain issues, you might not be covering a portion of your area that you would like to cover, and you're certainly entitled to cover by virtue of your contour, and you can put a booster there. I would say that you don't need to have an advanced degree in booster technology if you have great terrain shielding. because the more terrain shielding you have, the simpler the problem is to solve. The less terrain shielding you have, the more complex it gets to mitigating interference.
Yeah. So if you have terrain shielding, you're going to have fewer swaths of land that have similar field strengths from the two stations, the booster and the main, right?
Exactly. And in fact, there are some boosters out there that operate under extreme terrain shielding that don't even require synchronization.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just thought of one more question before we get to the last one. So go back to the flat terrain example, and you've got station A and station B, and you've got this area of similar field strength where you want to optimize that with good synchronization. What is the shape of that area as you move in a line that would be a tangent to a straight line between the two transmitters? So is it a tangent to the circle of each, or does it broaden out as you get in any direction? What does that area look like?
It's tangential, definitely. And that's one of the reasons when we're dealing with boosters that we can pick site location and we can pick directional antenna patterns to aid in the design, as opposed to the situation I have in Sarasota where we just didn't really have any of those benefits. We just had to deal with omnidirectional antennas over a wide area.
Okay. You're probably familiar, I'll get the last question. You're probably familiar with that situation of a single frequency network that our friend Grady Moats put in Boston, where they had three Class A stations. Now, they were fully spaced. So they're, and I don't know what kind of terrain they had between them, but there was still some area of interference and overlap amongst them. And the owner of those three stations wanted the same programming on all three stations, same frequency. So they used a non-synchronized system, and they used a couple of interesting techniques. And they happened to use the Omnia MPX nodes, which you could dial in their buffering, although they're not GPS disciplined. So it's possible for them to float a packet either direction, right? But they said it wasn't terribly necessary for them to be within microseconds, only a few milliseconds as you traveled from one to another. What would you say about a non-synchronized SFN? What conditions make those an okay solution?
Well, in the Boston area, you do have some terrain shielding because you have rolling terrain. So that's a help. Yeah. And the second thing that he did, which is not really done much, but they seem to feel it was effective. I've never played with it, but they used a little frequency diversity by an FM signal in the United States is allowed to be or required to be within 2,000 hertz of its center carrier frequency. So they would warp the frequencies of these transmitters to the upper or lower end of that frequency range, and that would help the receiver's capture ratio a little bit. So that was just another thing they could use to their benefit.
Gotcha. So they were fully spaced Class A's, a little bit of overlap, perhaps some terrain shielding because you have some rolling hills, and that frequency diversity. So let's say, I don't know what frequency they're on, let's say they're 94.3. They'd set transmitter A to be 94.3 minus about 1950 hertz, because you're allowed that. By the way, back in the old days of early FM exciters, it may have been a struggle to keep the thing on carrier within plus or minus 2 kilohertz, which is why it was set to that. But today's modern exciters are very accurate. You can keep them right on frequency. And so if you set it to 1950 hertz low, it's going to stay there. And the next transmitter would be set to 1950 high, and it would stay there. And so there was some capture ratio benefit to that diversity, as you mentioned, right?
Exactly. And again, I'm not aware of anybody else trying that. It's an interesting concept. I've not played with it. In our case, being GPS disciplined at the sites, you really don't have any way to warp it. If you're GPS locking, you're going to get a 10 megahertz crisp reference out of that GPS receiver, and that is synthesizing your carrier. And unless you change that 10 megahertz to something other than 10 megahertz, your carrier is going to come out where it's supposed to be.
Exactly.
So they're actually warping the internal reference of the exciter to do that, and you couldn't do that in a true SFN.
Right. Unless you change the software, make it count different.
Right. Yeah, I suppose you could do that. You could somehow, get the transmitter to interpret it differently.
We're with Hal Kneller, our 521st episode, talking about single frequency networks. Hal's going to be back with a tip of the week here in just a couple minutes. Our show This Week in Radio Tech is also brought to you in part by our friends at Angry Audio. This is one of the Angry Audio products. I love talking about this one because I just like saying pantyhose. See, with this one, you won't snag your pantyhose on this headphone amp if it's mounted right underneath here. I've got some headphone amps in here. They are Studio Hub headphone amps, which, by the way, you can also get from Angry Audio. But this one's got this cool kind of sexy case that goes under your counter, and it's got both kinds of headphone jacks, country and Western. Right? It's got a 1/4 inch and an 1/8 inch headphone jack. It's got a nice volume control right here, and on the back, you can power this over the Cat5 cable using the Studio Hub standard. You can also inject your power right here as well and carry that power onto other Studio Hub, or other Angry Audio headphone amps. This is the Headphone Gizmo is the name of it, and just a most awesome, nice device. Angry Audio also has the whole Studio Hub line, especially these adapters. And if you've ever wired a studio with these, you never want to wire one any other way because they're so convenient. You use this end goes to your equipment, this end goes to a Cat5 cable, and then you just run your Cat5 cable, and it works with analog stereo or AES digital. Either way, it works just great. And you can get these terminated in lots of different ways. Here's a 1/4 inch tip ring sleeve, and of course there's that RJ45 connector. If you want to use ones that just don't need a separate Cat5 cable, but are the audio cables themselves run into an RJ45 connector, they have those as well. This one, I believe, is 6 feet long. They come in different lengths. And some people prefer this. I prefer the other way. And by the way, here's something I did one time. I think I was using this with a piece of AES gear, and I didn't want to, they have single ones that, just for us AES digital, but I wanted to just tie this. I didn't want to cut it off. Didn't want to cut that side off because I may want to take it apart and use it again someday for an analog stereo. So I just tied it back like that and used that for the AES digital. That's the left side is for the AES digital. So works great either way. angryaudio.com is the website, angryaudio.com. They got your Studio Hub stuff. They got your Bluetooth gizmo, the audio gizmo, the Bluetooth audio gizmo. It turns your cell phone into a phone hybrid for your console, and so much more. Check it out at angryaudio.com. All right, I've mentioned that. I want to also mention our friends at Max Connect Wireless. They make possible a lot of our remotes. When Chris Tobin is doing the show, when he appears on This Week in Radio Tech from the internals of some building or from the externals of some building on a rooftop, and when we're together at the NAB show in Las Vegas, I know it's been a while, may continue to be a while, we use Max Connect Wireless to get assured data connectivity with back to the This Week in Radio Tech. I'm sorry, the GFQ network. Radio stations across the country, America and in Canada, are using Max Connect Wireless to do live remotes, to handle, let's say you have to go into a meeting, like a city council meeting, and get live audio from there, and city council just ain't that accommodating for your IP needs to get your audio back. Well, a Max Connect Wireless 4G LTE modem will do it. And again, what makes it special, it's not just an ordinary 4GE like you'd get out of your phone, because Max Connect Wireless actually has their own APNs. I forget what APN stands for, but it means you get your own data channel on the Verizon network, the AT&T network, the T-Mobile network, the Sprint network. You get your own channels there that are unencumbered by competing for packets with other users. You can be in a stadium full of people. I know sometime when COVID's over, you can be in a stadium full of people. They can all be on their cell phones. You've got your Max Connect Wireless, and you've got the data bandwidth that you paid for. It's absolutely amazing, the technology. People also use these at their transmitter sites. You know why? Because they have a fixed IP address. You get a static public IP address with Max Connect Wireless. So it's great for remoting into equipment at your transmitter site. because you know where it's going to be. Check it out, maxconnectwireless.com. Thanks so much to Josh Bone. What a smart guy, and persistent too, to work out these deals with the major carriers so that you can get prioritized IP data over 4G LTE. Thanks a lot, Josh, and Max Connect Wireless for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, Hal, we just got a couple minutes left. Wonder if you have a tip that you'd like to leave with our viewers and listeners about single frequency networks, or any topic that you're professionally interested in here for broadcast. What you got?
Somewhat related to this, but I was a little afraid of AES 192, composite over IP, because I lived through the days of using AES 3 after the processor going into an exciter and having the overshoot problems. When many of us discovered it was better to have the Omnia or whatever you had at your transmitter site composite feeding the exciter directly. And so when we had to go back to this processing at the studio and feeding AES, I'm thinking, I don't want to go through that. You know, we get that peaky business and we lose some modulation, loudness, and whatever. I discovered that AES 192 isn't like AES 3 at all. So don't be afraid of it.
Yeah. Good point. And I know that my friend and co-founder Frank Foti was part of getting AES 192 going. I think we had a marketing name, Omnia Direct, but several of the processor companies are doing composite over AES 192, and that is bit for bit perfect. You just can't get any more perfect than that. It's absolutely linear when you carry it that way. In fact, you can't code it. You need to carry it linearly from one side to another. And you're right, it's so accurate. Thanks for that tip. Don't be afraid of AES 192. It does work, and it's super, super clean. You don't get, I'm big on composite signal cleanliness. And it's, if you can deliver a clean composite signal to your exciter, you're going to get out farther, and you're going to sound better than if you run it over a noisy STL. And by noisy, I mean a well-working composite STL is still noisy. Hal Kneller, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate your knowledge, time, and experience. It's been great to hear your experiences with this SFN. My pleasure to be with you, Kirk. All right. Thanks again. All right. We have more good shows for you this year. We're not done. We got several coming up in December. It's always on Thursdays, 5 p.m. Eastern time. And we appreciate you joining us. I want to thank Hal. I also want to thank SynchroCast, our producer of This Week in Radio Tech. Thanks also to Andrew Zarian, who is the founder of the GFQ Network. Gives us a place to call home. There's other great podcasts on the GFQ Network, so please check them out. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit like and subscribe. Make a comment if you like. We'll certainly try to reply to it. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye.